there, about 2 feet above the water level, there's a change in color. It's darker. That's it. That's the contact. The lighter gray is the upper part of the Kashakwa. The black is the base of the Rhinestreet along here. You're looking at about half of the Rhinestreet in this area. It's about 55 meters thick or so here. You can see that it's got some zones of gray shale. If you follow this unit in the subsurface to the east of here, it quickly becomes gray shale. So that when you get over to a place like Letchworth State Park, the Rhinestreet is comprised of maybe 1 or 2, maybe luckily 2 meters of black shale, then gray shale. Each of those black shale correlates with the base of these cycles of black shale. So the black shale quickly becomes siltier and less organic off to the east, and it happens very, very fast. It's really tough to work with Rhinestreet over in that area. You just don't have this. You can see some of the really large concretions that we can see at the very top up there. You can see one sticking out. Again, way up there is a large concretion, but we're not going to be going up there for it. See way over there sticking out. Got a problem on the lighter color over there. Orange tree. Those are some big concretions. It almost looks like it's much.
Yeah.
You can see another one if you follow this green tree all the way up to the top of it and just to the right. There's one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Some of these are quite large.
And
we'll be coming back here, but we'll be walking up that way. If we can get it.
Where's that 93 come
Yeah, remember the Middlesex, the Kashakwa, then the Rhinestreet. There's the bottom of the Rhinestreet. Now we're continuing up. And one of the things we've been doing with this stuff is we've started to work through some magnetic susceptibility on this. And the magnetic susceptibility curve, what you do is you pass a weak magnetic field through a rock sample, and certain paramagnetic minerals like clays will acquire a weak magnetism. You can pick that up. And so on figure 2.6 on the right is the magnetic susceptibility curve. It's very, very sensitive. We can use this to work out sea level changes, but you can see as you read off to the right, the magnetic susceptibility increases, and that's an indication of increasing clay, increasing plastic flux, lowering sea level. And so we can see if you look at that curve, as you come up out of the Middlesex, you quickly increase the magnetic susceptibility. The sea level is lowering at the end of the Middlesex transgression. And so as you came up that, but then you can see maybe a bit more than half of the way up into the Kashakwa, the magnetic susceptibility drops again. And that's because sea level is starting to rise and we are reducing the plastic flux. One of the interesting things that we're looking at is at the very top of the Kashakwa, you can see the magnetic susceptibility fluctuating back and forth. The group I'm working with is doing some spectral analysis on the cyclicity in this curve to see if we can pull out, say, the precessional scale as a means for driving all this. And it looks like it's operating on about a 20,000 year cycle, which is pretty close to precession. The other thing to look at is right about almost halfway up in the Rhinestreet, the magnetic susceptibility increases. Now you think, all right, it's black shale, but we're getting more clay into it. And in a lot of people's minds, that may not be too compatible, but if you look at the TOC curve, it's really quite amazing. The TOC drops as the magnetic susceptibility goes up. So what you're seeing there is a good example of dilution. When it looks like it's good black shale in there, but on a very close scale, you can see that sea level was fluctuating, was affecting the amount of clay fluxing into the system, which was affecting the organic carbon content, and these are things that are extremely subtle, and it's being brought out though by this magnetic susceptibility. So it's a really neat sequence. We've done this over about 30 meters of rock and are trying to put this together into some framework. Thanks, Randy.
So can you use it for correlation?
Oh yeah.
Pretty well.
Yeah,
so
magnetic susceptibility is very good for correlation.
Even when your section's expanding or you're you're able to feel confident in
Yeah.
where you are within the.
Yeah, it's a very useful tool for that. We just started doing it out in these deposits. And we were sampling these on about people will sample on a 2 centimeter scaling or less. We sampled this on about a 10 centimeter scale. Mostly because it's not easy to get the good sample. Then there's weathering issues you have to watch out. And you might, well, what about the presence of pyrite and that sort of? That's a ferromagnetic. That'll give you a strong signal, but you can identify those areas, and when you sample, you try to stay away from lots of pyrite, that sort of thing. You can also tell that this is coming. The paramagnetic signal is coming from illite because of the temperature at which it acquires the magnetism. So you can qualitatively work out some mineralogy.
So, as someone who's new to the basin, if I was coming in and working out the stratigraphy, what are your tools that you find to be the most helpful?
Chemostratigraphy, magnetic susceptibility. I think isotope studies are useful for picking out unique intervals that uses high lines. And you don't always get good signals. For example, in that isotope profile I showed you earlier, the Middlesex shows a strong positive peak, and that's in organic rich shale. So then we also see a strong positive excursion in organic lean shale. So immediately I think, well, why are we seeing that? Because there's not much organic matter here. Because what it's telling us is that we were connected to the global ocean, and we were getting a signal from the global carbon inventory. And so that's very useful to pick that sort of thing out.
Does the biostratigraphy help you at all?
Yeah, we don't have real good control
Not much you can do
in
with it
here.
to help
In
us
this,
other-
we've got zonation is working out reasonably well.
the
the
big-
Conant
big
zonation.
chunk, the Conant?
Yeah, but actually, I tell you, the magnetic susceptibility work they're finding is much more precise than biostratigraphy.
And you have the resolution.
Oh yeah, the one I was showing you on Randy's at the top of the chocolate. You've got these 3 black shale layers. So we went through there, and you can really see it's fluctuating. You get this curve of diminishing magnetic susceptibility. So sea level's dropping, but impressed upon that is this pattern. It's amazing, and that's the cyclicity. The drop in sea level, or the rise in sea level, as you're coming up to the Rhinestreet, is the global sea level rise related to the Rhinestreet event. And then impressed upon that is a very short-term sea level fluctuation. And those are the sorts of perhaps precessional events that we're looking
I
at.
just remember when I was working in Trinidad, West Indies, I know that it was tough because the section would change sometimes so quickly, and sometimes the oxygen isotopes were tricky.
The oxygen, now
So
the
you
oxygen,
think you could-
yeah, oxygen isotopes. We've done those.
But you think the magnetic susceptibility?
I think magnetic
is a lot
susceptibility
better.
is a really accurate tool. Oxygen isotopes can be reset. You can use oxygen isotopes to assess the salinity of the water. You can use it to assess paleo temperatures.
People are trying to correlate with it.
It's kind of nuts because of resetting, recrystallization, that sort of thing.
We have, and I'll show the plot, it might even be in here, but I'll definitely be showing it Tuesday. But you can see a dramatic offset. The carbon isotopic signature, the concretions, is largely all the same, no matter where you're looking in the basin, whether it's from the Geneseo concretions, Rhinestreet concretions, Marcellus concretions. The carbon isotopes are all the same, but there's distinct changes in the oxygen zonations, the function of how deeply buried those sections were. So you have a big shift when you go down into Geneseo and the Marcellus, versus if you're looking at like these Rhinestreet concretions here, which is, we think, goes back to them being reset.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, the carbon. Now we've done some work on carbon isotopes across concretions, and we think we can make a case that these concretions. I don't know if you want to talk about our mechanism, the anaerobic oxidation of methane. That we believe that one of the things we find about these concretions is that they are confined to specific stratigraphic horizons. They're not necessarily connected, but they're confined to them. So it seems that something was controlling
It goes over a large
this,
distance.
and yeah, they or controlling this stratigraphy. So we started casting about for mechanisms, and the one that seems to work best is anaerobic oxidation of methane. If you're bringing methane up from below, and you're moving seawater sulfate down, combine methane with seawater sulfate, what you get is bicarbonate plus hydrogen sulfide and some water. The bicarbonate combines with the calcium and you start to get the carbonate concretions forming. The sulfide combines with iron and you get the pyrite that's associated with the concretions. That's it. Now, what's critical to that, though, is why. The question then is, why are they along specific stratigraphic horizons? And the critical part of this is slowing down the sedimentation rate and therefore the burial rate, so that you hold that diagenetic interval, that horizon, in that diagenetic zone for an extended period of time, and you can build up the alkalinity levels and you can allow these things to grow. You always have a sulfate, as long as you have methane coming up, unless it's such a high flux that it vents into the ocean, you're going to consume it. That's important to the climate. I mean, you can make the case that one of the things that has helped maintain our climate over geologic time is that process. Otherwise, you'd have methane seeping into the water, and ultimately, when it has a short half-life, comes CO2. But anaerobic oxidation of methane essentially traps methane in the subsurface, converts it to carbonate and pyrite. And so, what we're arguing for then is that this sequence is not linear in terms of burial and sedimentation, that it's a staccato type of mechanism. Drops down, stabilizes, drops down, because the sediments are always passing through that zone, but they never have enough time to stay there to nucleate, immense concretions like that. It takes time to do that. So you look at some of the modern work, DSDP and ODP work, they're finding that in these zones of modern anaerobic oxidation of methane, alkali levels are extremely high. And that's what's necessary to get the concretions to form. So we decided to look at and Randy will be talking about some of it, I guess, on Tuesday. We can actually see the concretions entering that zone and even exiting the zone. And we can see changes in the nature of anaerobic oxidation of methane by the cross-concretion profiles of the isotope signature. We can actually see it leaving it. There's something called reverse anaerobic oxidation of methane, which occurs under conditions of very low or zero sulfate. That happens just below the anaerobic zone, what's called the sulfate methane transition. That's where this happens. And so that's what we think is happening here. We've always pondered where the biogenic methane is coming from, and it seems intuitive that, well, it's coming from the black shale below it. But biogenic methane takes time to occur, and it takes a bit and heat can move it along faster. And I would maintain that it's possible that some of this could be coming from as deep as the Utica. And the evidence for that is when you look at places like the Blake Plateau off the southeast United States, where you have this process happening now, the source of the methane are these gas hydrate systems a kilometer down. So it doesn't have to be coming directly from beneath it. It can be coming from even lower. And so we did some modeling of the Utica, and at the time this was happening, the Utica was not really, it was just slightly into the thermogenic methane window. So much of up to that point had been biogenic methane. Along fractures and advecting along fractures, because all that carbonate is extremely brittle. I don't know.
And here too, we don't have salt.
We don't
So we don't have an
salt out
impermeable
here,
barrier between that and what's up above like you do in the rest of the basins.
They're very fascinating, and we never find fossils in them. A lot of concretions you do find something around which the carbonate nucleated.
Now, if you read some of the work in Ohio, they'll say that they are, but when you actually go in and look at them, they're often not. But these things are so massive, it's probably more likely that occasionally fossil material gets incorporated.
Yeah, you
into
can see when you look at the concretions, you can see the post-sediment structure preserved. You can see layers. So the models that they group principally, but not completely, principally by passive infill at a very shallow depth. Because when you look at it with the SEM, you can see the original card house clay grain fabric preserved, which means precipitation had to occur so early that you hadn't collapsed that very early, highly electrostatic card house, mica or platy grain geometry. You can also see fossils that are extremely well preserved. They haven't been crushed. Now there is a bit of displacive growth, so that when the calcite starts to form, there is some wedging apart. There's that one picture in that paper that we have where it wedged the framboid.
Yep.
You can actually see it open the framboid up and wedge it apart, but it's principally, we believe, by passive infilling into the original void of the sediment.
Because the carbonate percentage in the concretions matches roughly what the depositional porosity of the mudstones would have been. And even if you argue the amount of displacive growth you see is largely offset by the present day porosity that's still in them. So those carbonate percentages are roughly an indication of what the original porosity of the muds were. And if you go back to where they have the profile, it's really shallow.
Yeah, that was important because we wrote a paper on using these as strain compaction strain gauges, and we were able to use that to get an idea at which point overpressuring in the black shale began. The point at which you stop the overpressure buildup precluded further reduction of mechanical compaction, and to do that you had to have a gauge that formed essentially at the sediment water interface. So they're fascinating structures.
So they also then pose a risk to drilling, which is largely what we're going to talk about on Tuesday. But what we often hear the drillers, geosteers saying we're drilling into limestone stringers. And but when you look at a lot of these deposits, continuous limestones outside of things like the Cherry Valley, the Stafford and stuff like that, they don't really exist. So one of the questions, are what are these things? And another observation we commonly find is that when they encounter these limestones, the bit gets let me move over here. The bit gets deflected in random directions. Sometimes it goes up, down, off to the sides, and part of the efficiency issues we're having to deal with there is that then we got to slide in order to get back on target, either vertically or horizontal, or side to side, in order to get on that line there. And so one of the questions is, what are these things, and can we go about predicting them? And the fact that they are stratigraphically confined allows us to be able to do that. Now one of the techniques that I've used, one thing you can do is make direct observations in geophysical well logs of them, but inherent to that is that the well bore actually has to penetrate one, or it has to go close enough that it's within the depth of investigation of the tools, which is a couple feet, basically. And that doesn't always happen. But what you can sometimes see in these instances is, again, what they require is a hiatus in sedimentation. So what I started looking at was uranium to TOC ratios in these rocks, and the idea being that uranium attaches to organic matter across the sediment water interface, absorbs onto that organic material, and the amount of uranium then that organic material holds is largely a function of how long that organic material is in contact with anoxic water. So in other words, 5% TOC might have 20 parts per million uranium attached to it under normal sedimentation conditions, but when you get a shutdown that has more time to build, you may see 50, 60 parts per million uranium on there. So you'd see this uranium to TOC excursion that would be associated with a shutdown in sedimentation. So what I kind of came up with is the idea of a concretion watch versus a concretion warning system there, where if the log's actually penetrating, you can identify them on the well logs. This is generally, you'll see a decrease in gamma ray, an increase in bulk density, and in PE coming in around 5. That likely then what you're seeing is evidence of a limestone, and if it's not within you'd expect where to see it in the sequence stratigraphy of being the Cherry Valley or something like that, it's likely a concretion horizon. But then the other thing you can do then is plot uranium to TOC and find these excursions and make an argument then that those are hiatuses in sedimentation, are potential areas where concretions may be within a foot or two of where those excursions are. And we've done that on some wells where we actually have identified concretions in core and have found that we have those uranium to TOC excursions that occur at the same depth or right near the depth of concretion in the core. So that's a way to do it. And then the idea would be then is that your target zones, then you'd say, okay, we need to either stay above or below this, because passing through them is not bad, right? I mean, you can drill well bore over there, and the chance of you hitting one of these things is quite rare. But once you start going horizontally through there, you're going to be hitting them and going through them and hitting them, going through them. And you know, and one of the arguments you'll hear a lot of too is, you know, well, we drilled this well right next to it in the same stratigraphic horizon, and we never saw them. You know, so it couldn't be there. But again, think of the resolution of the tools that we're using. It's pretty coarse resolution when you come to think about something that's averaging 2 feet. Now, when I looked at a lot of this data, what I did was we've measured probably about 100 of these concretions, the X and Y axis of them, and these have a tendency to grow to the top of the that zone of anaerobic oxidation of methane. They can't go any higher, so they start growing laterally. So you get up over about 60 centimeters tall, and they just start growing laterally. But below that, you can use the vertical axis of this then to predict what the horizontal axis is of concretions. Now, the other thing I had to do was that in the core, you're not necessarily going right down through the center. So based on the geometry of the beds, above and below the concretion in the core, you can fit an ellipse of that and figure out what that vertical dimension is on there, and then use the relationship of these concretions in order to figure out what that horizontal axis is. And what we found is that in the basal parts of the Marcellus, these things can get as much as 3 to 4 feet on the horizontal axis, you know, and maybe like 1.5 foot or 2 feet tall. So again, you're dealing with something that's kind of at the resolution of what the volume of rock that these logs are averaging. So it's entirely possible that you could skim a bit's diameter above these things or below them and never see them there. So the fact that you're in the quote same stratigraphic horizon doesn't necessarily mean that within the resolution of what we can do, we're in the exact same stratigraphic horizon. So on one well you might be in one of these zones and hit it, you know, quite often, and another well you might be just above or below it, but as best we can tell, we're in the same spot as we were. Now, because these things are very persistent too, you know, you'll find these, if we could have gotten to Sturgeon Point, you can see them out there. We've traced them into the subsurface where they occasionally do cut them with Medina wells that they've drilled through here, and you'll see them in there. So they occur over a large geographic area. We've seen nothing that would indicate at wellbore spacing of 500 to 1,500 feet that they would be present here, but not up where the cars are or further. So, and then one last thing too to talk about, you know, and Gary mentioned the idea of the great example of dilution here. Again, going back to targeting, an important thing that we want to avoid is high clay content. And the reason for that, you know, one of the things we always hear from the completion engineers is, oh, we frack into it, we frack into everything. And there's no doubt in my mind, if we drilled a well bore here at the creek bed, we'd frack through that entire section. But what happens to the conductivity of those fractures through time as we produce the wells? So these things have a pore pressure, right? They're pushing out and they're keeping stuff open, but that pore pressure is a function of what we're extracting from the rock. It's the gas that's flowing out. So what's happening is you have a compressive stress on that rock that's not changing. It is what it is a function of, you know, the burial depth there in the remote stress field. And then the pore pressure is counteracting that. And as we reduce that pore pressure, then we're increasing the effective stress on the rock. And the higher the clay content, the higher we see the effects of the Poisson effect, which is basically, you know, you push down this way, how much does it expand in this direction? That's going to increase as a function of increasing clay content. And you can see it, you can take, you know, Poisson's ratio from rock mechanics, you know, a sonic curve. You can calculate clay volume from a bulk density neutron cross plot, and you'll see that Poisson ratio tracks almost exactly with your clay volume curve up there. So when we get into these areas of higher clay content, you know, we run the risk of shutting down permeability of those fractures through times we produce a reservoir. And one of the greatest examples of that is the Haynesville. You know, that was, you know, going to make the Marcellus look like nothing because of the IPs of these Haynesville wells. But what they found is after a month or two, you know, those days come crashing down as these things tighten up, and that's a much higher clay volume rock than the Marcellus. And then we also run the risk then too of, you know, if we strand gas, you know, from a fracture that's, you know, maybe 10 or 15 meters above the wellbore, yeah, we're still losing that gas that's up there. But if we're in that high clay zone and we shut that down at the wellbore, now we've stranded gas from anywhere to keep it from entering the wellbore. So that's why, yeah, we frack into everything, but we don't necessarily produce from everything through the life of that wellbore, and that's why it's so important that we target these zones of enhanced silica.